Most gamers don't like blurry or distorted images, especially in PvP games. So it is no surprise that when we start the game for the first time, we instantly go to the options menu and disable everything that even remotely sounds like it will cause the game to apply a blur to the rendered image. Another step to ensure that what we see on our monitor is as sharp as possible is to make sure that the game runs at the highest refresh rate that is supported by our monitor. And to get the most out of that refresh rate, we also make sure that we choose graphics settings that allow the game to run at a frame rate that reaches the refresh rate of our monitor. These are fast, easy and free measures to improve the motion clarity in our games. But what if games still have a blur, like you can see here? The next thing we can do is open the on-screen display menu on our monitor and look for a setting called ULMB or ULMB2. Which stands for Ultra Low Motion Blur and aims to eliminate or at least reduce the visible motion blur caused by the display. Sadly, there's a catch. You cannot use ULMB and G-Sync at the same time. You can either have a low latency, silky smooth and tear-free experience with G-Sync or very low motion blur with ULMB. Personally, I always chose G-Sync over ULMB because I cannot stand the tearing and the stutter as well as the increased system latency that you are subjected to without G-Sync. But seems like we don't have to choose anymore, as Nvidia just announced G-Sync Pulsar, which adds the motion blur reduction known from ULMB to G-Sync. However, it's not as simple as just strobing the entire backlight like ULMB does, as that would lead to a very noticeable flicker since G-Sync dynamically adjusts the refresh rate of the display to match the frame rate of the game you are playing. For G-Sync Pulsar, a new display had to be developed. So how does it work? Typically, a LCD monitor has a backlight that shines light through the crystal array. When your graphics card is done rendering an image, it gets sent to the monitor, where the LCD crystal array is then updated from top to bottom. That is called a scan out. You can think of it like an upside down curtain that reveals the image. On a traditional monitor, the backlight is always on, and since the crystals need time to update or transition to their new state, this reduces the sharpness of the edges of objects that are moving on your monitor. This delay is called the pixel response time. Another side effect of the backlight constantly blasting light through the crystal array and into your eyes is that our retina holds on to the brightness and contrast of the image. And so moving objects blend from one to the next, which leads to a visible blur. A ULMB monitor aims to fix both these issues by keeping the backlight off while the crystal array is updating, and pulses once the crystals have transitioned to their new state. The backlight of a G-Sync Pulsar display is much more complex. It has been split up into 10 sections that can be lit independently. When a scan-out takes place, each section is lit up just before the pixels are updated. This means that pixels have almost a full frame time to achieve their correct values to ensure that moving elements show up in the right place. Since the backlight strobes at 25% of the frame time, this should improve the motion clarity by a factor of 4. Which means that when you play at 100 FPS on a Pulsar display, the visible motion blur should be equal to playing at 400 FPS on a 400 Hz monitor without Pulsar. That is of course a simplified explanation of that technology, as there is much more to it, like how the strobing patterns need to be adjusted to the refresh rate that is constantly changing, or how the display avoids that you see a flicker, and a lot more when it comes to the timings of this display. However, I'm sure that what you really want to know is what it looks like in action, and if it's worth to invest in a new monitor. While I cannot answer the last question, I can show you how G-Sync Pulsar improves display motion blur and what level of motion clarity it achieves. Now, it would be great if I only had to point my camera at the monitor and record a video to show you the difference. But since part of the problem is how our retina holds on to light and contrast and so contributes to the problem of how much blur we see, the process to show you that blur in a YouTube video is a bit more involved. Let me explain by using the excellent UFO test provided by blurbusters.com. Depending on the device that you are watching this video on, the effect of this test might not fully come across. So I recommend that you go to testufo.com and run the test there. When you focus on the center of your display, then you will have a hard time to make out details on the UFOs. And those boxes in the sync track will line up diagonally. You will see something like this. But when you follow a UFO as it moves from the left to the right, then you will not only see that UFO clearer, you will also notice that the boxes in the sync track now line up vertically. It looks like this. However, when I take a screenshot on the PC, then a single frame as it is rendered by the graphics card looks like this. So that should make clear that in order to show you the impact that G-Sync Pulsar has on motion clarity, it is required to not only mimic how you just used your eyes to track the UFO as it was moving from the left to the right, I also need to mimic how our eyes work, especially how our retina holds on to light and contrast. This means that I need to move a camera at the same speed as the element that I'm tracking on the monitor. And then I need to take an image using the correct exposure to blend multiple rendered images together like our eyes do. This setup is called a pursuit camera, and you will see many other reviewers use such a setup and the excellent UFO test from Blurbusters when testing display motion blur. However, this setup has a few limitations, and you can end up with images that show a blur that isn't there because you need to manually move the camera at the exact same speed as the UFO. The sync track makes it easier to notice when you move the camera at the wrong speed, as the boxes will not line up then. However, if you want to do such tests in a game, then you don't have that sync track and might end up with a blur in your image that isn't there. So while Blurbusters provides an excellent test, I decided that I want to approach this differently. Which is why I mounted a mouse to my camera slider. So when I now move the slider, then both the camera and the mouse move together. But that alone doesn't help me much, as the mouse needs to move an element across the monitor. So my son created a test application, which is essentially a video game where the mouse moves an element left and right. I can also choose between different elements and backgrounds. So once everything is set up and lined up properly, I dial in the sensitivity so that the element travels the same distance on the monitor as the mouse and camera that are attached to the slider. This is how I can easily run tests at any frame rate and any speed I like. Now let me show you what display motion blur looks like in motion, and later I will tell you why video is not the best way to capture it. Here the test application runs at 95 FPS with G-Sync enabled and Pulsar disabled. You can clearly see the blur around the training bots. To switch on Pulsar, I just open the OSD menu and switch it on. When I now move the camera slider again, you can see that there is a lot less blur. You might also be able to see some flickering, but that is only visible to the camera, it is not visible to the human eye. So that video shows Pulsar in motion, but as I said, it is not ideal because this camera does not allow me to dial in the exposure perfectly when it is in video mode. It also only provides a limited selection of frame rates to record that, and as many cameras, it also suffers from rolling shutter. This is why you should always use still images when evaluating display motion blur. Now let's compare how much motion clarity is affected by refresh rate and frame rate. Here we can clearly see that when going from 95 to 144 to 250 and finally 350 FPS with the matching refresh rate as G-Sync is active, the image does get a lot clearer when you play at higher refresh rates and frame rates. When we then compare these to the images I took with G-Sync Pulsar active, we see a quite significant improvement at lower frame rates. But even at higher frame rates, an improvement is still clearly visible. I can also use a high-resolution screenshot of Enno in my test application to show you the impact that G-Sync Pulsar has on panning. Again, at 95 FPS. Regardless of which test scenario I threw at this monitor, I was quite impressed with the difference that Pulsar made, especially at lower frame rates, which will help those of us who can't keep investing in new CPUs, GPUs and now RAM in order to play the latest and greatest games at a high frame rate to reduce the visible motion blur. Now, full disclosure, Nvidia sent me this monitor to take a look at their G-Sync Pulsar technology. I was not paid to test it. I was not paid to give feedback, and I did not have to make this video. I decided to make it because I think that this technology is both impressive and helpful. Going into this test, I expected to find some issues, as it is usually the case when you test products that have not yet hit the market. And during my tests I have found a couple, which I did report back to Nvidia, and I was told that they are working with their partners to fix these issues before the first monitors get shipped. However, at the time that I am working on this video, that firmware update is still being worked on. The monitor that I got for testing is the ASUS ROG Strix XG27AQNGV, which is one of the first 4 monitors that support G-Sync Pulsar. These 4 monitors all use the same 27-inch IPS display, which can do up to 360 Hz at 1440p. So it's likely that all 4 monitors have the issues that I encountered. Like many ASUS gaming monitors, this one has an FPS counter, which is actually a refresh rate counter, as it shows you the active refresh rate when enabled. Here you can see how the monitor's so-called FPS counter shows how G-Sync changes the refresh rate to match the game's frame rate. You will also notice that the actual frame rate counter from the Nvidia overlay is a bit delayed, because it doesn't update as frequently as the monitor's FPS counter. Now, you might have noticed that in my tests I did not go below 95 FPS. When I set the frame rate limiter in Overwatch to 95, then the monitor runs at 95 Hz, as G-Sync matches the frame rate. When I set the frame rate limiter to 91, then the monitor's refresh rate runs at double the frame rate. It displays every frame twice, which is what these monitors usually do when the frame rate is outside the variable refresh rate range. But that should only happen when the frame rate drops below 30 FPS, not already below 95 FPS. When I go down to 44 FPS, then we are right on the edge where frame doubling turns into frame tripling. And at 30 FPS, it even turns into frame quadrupling. That is not the expected behavior of a G-Sync display. The second issue is related to Pulsar, so let's turn that on. In the video you can now see the pulsing of the backlight, which is not visible to the human eye. Now, Pulsar works inside a specific refresh rate range, and when the frame rate drops below the set limit, then the backlight is on permanently and doesn't pulse anymore. That limit is 90 per default, and I've been told by Nvidia that this is the recommended limit, as lower values could result in some people noticing a flicker. However, you can change that limit to any value between 75 and 120. Now, the problem is that since below 95 FPS the monitor uses frame doubling, the refresh rate never goes below that threshold of 90. So when I set the limit to 95 and the frame rate to 92, the monitor runs at 184 Hz with the backlight very clearly strobing. When I set the frame rate limiter to 184, then the display also runs at about 184 Hz with the same strobing pattern visible to the camera as before. When I set the frame rate limiter to 95, which causes the monitor to run at 95 Hz and raise the Pulsar Low FPS limit to 120, then the backlight should no longer pulse. But as you can see in the video, it still does. For reference, this is what it looks like with Pulsar off and the backlight permanently on, and this is what it looks like with Pulsar on. As I said, I informed Nvidia about these issues that I experienced, and I was told that they and their partners are working on fixing them for the release of these monitors. And once I get that firmware update, I might do another video, or at the very least update the description here in this video, as well as leaving a pinned comment. So G-Sync Pulsar combines all the benefits we know from G-Sync and ULMB. It creates impressive results when it comes to motion clarity, especially at lower frame rates, while also providing the tear-free, silky smooth and low latency experience we know from G-Sync. As hardware components like graphics cards and now also RAM get increasingly expensive, many gamers simply cannot afford to constantly upgrade their PCs anymore to run the latest and greatest games at a high frame rate, or even a stable frame rate. Technologies like G-Sync, which prevents tearing and stutter by constantly adjusting the monitor's refresh rate to match a variable and so unstable frame rate, Reflex, which keeps the system latency at a minimum by preventing queuing while still pushing the graphics card close to the edge to squeeze as many FPS out of it as possible, and now Pulsar, that provides a level of motion clarity for which you would otherwise have to run the game at a much higher frame rate, are extremely helpful to get the most out of your PC and make delaying hardware upgrades less painful. especially since G-Sync, Reflex and Pulsar do not even require the latest and greatest hardware. If you have a GeForce 16 series, like a 1660 Super, then you can use all of them. So what's next? I hope that a side effect of hardware components getting increasingly expensive is that developers will once again put more effort into optimizing their code, like they were once required to do when our hardware was way less powerful. And I hope that we will see more useful innovations that help gamers to squeeze out more life out of their existing PCs. I would be interested in improving the prototype of my display motion blur test setup, which we really just quickly slapped together over the holidays using things I already had here. There was no time to order a larger camera slider, maybe even a motorized one, or look into better cameras for these tests. Testing other monitors like an OLED would also be very interesting in the future, so we will see what happens. Until then, have a nice day and take care.